Hey everyone, it's Sid. Welcome to the second episode of the interview by the Nordic Model, the podcast where we talk about social democratic policy positions, theory, and events of interest. This week, I'm very excited to be interviewing Keegs, who is one of the eminent apostles of James Medlock. Keegs is a democratic socialist that talks about the welfare state, the general inefficiencies of capitalism, and taxation policy. This week, I'll be interviewing them on the ideal welfare state and the taxation policy that surrounds it. Hi, Keegs. Welcome to the Nordic Model. We're really happy to have you. Do you want to give us a quick introduction of yourself before we get started on this what I hope to be an exciting interview on the ideal welfare state and taxation policy?
Sure, yeah. I'm Keegs, at Little Keegs Zero on Twitter. Probably see me around if you're listening to this. Real name is Jacob Keegan, by the way. Lore bit, that's why I'm named Keegs. It's a nickname for my last name. Um, yeah, I kind of I would say around maybe mid 2019, I started getting into socialist public policy more. Um, that's when I discovered our man Medlock, and kind of ever since then, I've tried to see my role as trying to be an intermediary between normal folks who want to learn some more about actual leftist policy proposals and how they'll improve their lives, and between economists and intellectuals and folks writing theory about leftism. And so yeah, that's mainly I focus on as you said, tax policy and welfare policy. And yeah, recently I'm on more of a heterodox economics kick, reading about some of that. And yeah, that's me.
All right, yeah, that's a very cool breakdown. Actually, I mean, I think one of the reasons I got introduced to, people like the great James Medlock was through you because I remember I was asking, I think this was like a year and a half ago, about like implicit, like kind of marginal taxation, and that's one of the things that got me more interested in social democratic policy. So yeah, you're definitely one of the people that helps bridge the gap between like purely theoretical stuff, but also kind of public policy positions. So it's a pleasure to have you here today. So
Yeah.
let's get into it. So today I kind of wanted to do a deep dive on welfare state regimes. But before we even get into that, I think one of the things we have to do is make the case for why we need a large and robust welfare state, like the kind that you vehemently propose, and like I guess more acutely make a case for social insurance in general. And so I know you've written a lot of articles on it, which I'll be linking when I do post this podcast. What is your
Yeah, sure.
case
So I think
for the need for a welfare state?
something interesting. This is something I was arguing about on Twitter today. Is when you dig into it, people can actually kind of have very different starting views for why they think we need a welfare state, right? Like if you talk to a conservative about it, they're going to give a conservative support at least some welfare. Usually, they're going to give a totally different answer than if you ask a socialist about it. And so I think the correct starting view here is this is actually one of the things that got me really into this area of Twitter. Is there's this piece by Matt Brunig called "Welfare Not Jobs," and it's like very simple article. Literally, the point of it, it just says half the population does not work. Like we do not, capitalism doesn't give them any money, so we need to get them money. Like that is very bare bones a point of the work. But I think like that's the core. That's the core of the welfare state. And important to note, even under socialism, right? There's still going to be tons of people who aren't working who are still going to, require income, even if even if we're taking profits away from capitalists. And so starting from that point, you basically have to start thinking about, okay, well, who are the non-workers, right? How do we make sure those folks are living good lives? And so if I remember from the piece, it's something like 45% of non-workers are children, 25% are the elderly. That's like 10% or so are like disabled and students, a little less are the unemployed. Um, and so I think, like I said, you always have to start from the viewpoint of like, okay, you got to get non-workers money. But every one of those groups, it's a little different, the justification for why, welfare is needed there. Um, with for someone like children, the classic example, which this is one of those things that like when somebody tells it to you, it's incredibly obvious, but it's hard to figure it out on your own, is like, if I'm whatever, I'm 23 years old right now, right? I would be better off if my parents had more money growing up, right? So, like, if possible, I would sacrifice some of my income now to get me, better off in the when I was a kid. That would leave me better off overall. But it's literally not possible for that to happen. That's not how time works. Um, and when you're a kid, it's not like you can take out a loan or something. That's literally, again, children literally cannot do that. Um, so that's kind of where the government needs to come in and make sure, children have support, whether it's, giving, child allowances to parents, making sure they get a good education, making sure they got childcare, all that stuff. Um, and so, yeah, that's a good example because the market literally cannot provide that. It's impossible for that to happen. And I think, we'll probably talk about this as the conversation goes on. A lot of people try to kind of do these clunky policies to like twist and push the market into doing that stuff, and it never really works out that well. For one reason or another, the market fundamentally cannot provide that stuff. And one other thing I want to note, because this is a conservative point that we brought up a lot, is they'll say, oh, we don't want welfare, we should just do charity instead. And a couple things to that point. One, charity has never remotely had as large of effect on poverty as welfare does. It's literally not even close. Like Social Security brings something like I think 38% of elderly people out of poverty every year. Charity's not going to do that. It never has, never will. And the other thing is that that's kind of, again, this is something, again, I was arguing about on Twitter today. The starting point for welfare is not thinking of it as poor relief. Ending poverty is a good thing, but that's not, the place to start from. Place to start from is that non-workers don't have an income and we need to get it to them. And charity isn't anything like that. It doesn't do that at all. Charity doesn't make sure, oh, if I'm unemployed, I'll still be getting enough money to, keep my family going, keep food on the table, whatever, give me time to find a new job. Charity doesn't do anything like that. Charity doesn't make sure you have enough money when you retire, even if you live longer than you expected. It's really kind of orthogonal to what welfare actually does.
Yeah, I think that's a very good answer. I think that the couple points that you brought up, I think they're especially important. Is that even in theoretical socialist states, we will need
Right.
some kind of redistributive measures because half the country at all times does not work, and we don't want half of this country to be working. Right? These are students, people with disabilities, old
Yep.
people, children, et cetera, et cetera. So it's important to not treat labor as like the kind of sole place where this basket of aftermarket income belongs to. And I also agree that the increased commodification of the welfare state is something that we want to push back on. Do you have any more to say on that? Kind of expound on something like that?
Yeah. So this is, starting to get into, the three worlds of welfare capitalism stuff. Is
A must read, by the way, to everybody listening.
it's our Bible, right? Um,
Absolutely, yeah.
yeah, it's why it's like one of the first books I decided to actually, write Medium articles on. Which, if you don't have a lot of time, you're welcome to read my Medium articles instead. There's 4 of them. It'll take you like a little over half an hour. You'll get the gist.
Yeah, I'll be linking them when I do put up the podcast. So
Yeah,
all the listeners, please do check it out. They're very well written.
highly recommend. Myself. But so yeah, the kind of and this touches on a couple things we said before. So the three worlds of welfare capitalism, broadly speaking, are the book talks about how there are kind of 3 approaches to welfare states. There's the you kind of gotta. It's interesting. You gotta think about this. You kind of start from liberalism, right? Liberalism is currently the dominant ideology, at least in the first world, and a lot of ideologies are responding to that in one way or another, right? And liberalism itself was responding to other stuff before that. Liberalism developed because there were states governments existed, but they were controlled by the aristocracy or monarchs and all that. So kind of it's an interesting quote where the author of Three Worlds, Esping Anderson, I'm probably butchering that name, but whatever. um, he mentions how Adam Smith reads a lot like Karl Marx sometimes because he's basically advocating for like this radical change in society to take power out of the hands of aristocrats and put it in the hands of normal people. And he thought, free markets are basically what could do that, right? Because, in a market, it's, what you get out of it is, it's a meritocracy, right? It's what you put in. It's, how productive you're being. It's not just about having a title or whatever, right? And so, yeah, that was kind of the how liberalism started with those ideas. And conservatives, on the other hand, again, conservatives, they're all about conserving what already exists. They're like, no, hold on a second. We don't want markets getting in the way of the church or getting in the way of the nuclear family. Or, there's a certain, conservatives think there's a certain order to the world, a certain way people are, above or below each other in hierarchies, and that's how it should be. So that's why a lot of times in the US, conservatives have the way they talk about economic policy is really confused a lot of the times because they try to mush together like this like free market liberal view with like the traditional conservative, patriarchal kind of views, and it doesn't make sense a lot of the time because they're not actually the same views at all. And so yeah, those are kind of and those are two of the two kinds of welfare regimes, because you have the liberal approach, which, like I said, tries to kind of tinker around the edges of the market. It'll give subsidies to, people who buy health insurance, or it'll give, means tested benefits. So not a lot of people get the benefits, only, the really poor people get it. It's trying not to mess around with the market too much because it views markets as, kind of the how you become free, in society. And conservatives, on the other hand, they're like that. Whatever, they'll screw with markets. That's not their main thing. But what they want to do is stuff like they want to uphold the traditional family. So they'll do stuff like this is a key difference actually that Esping Anderson expands on in later work. Is conservatives have a lot of policy that tie benefits to the household because they want the woman at home taking care of kids, basically. So yeah, you'll have policy like that, and you'll have another big one is pensions for people will be very stratified. There'll be tons of different pensions. So number Italy has like over 100 different pensions or something like that, depending on the industry you work in, and you have totally different rates and everything. Because it's kind of they kind of have this view of there's a social order to things. Some jobs are above or below others, right? And then of course, which I think that's kind of it's important to talk about those because in response to those is what what social democrats were responding to when they developed their welfare states. They didn't want to, the normal socialist concerns about markets, how, in practice, there's all this inequality, even moving beyond the whole, how capitalists, extract so much money. As we said before, so much of the population doesn't work and markets don't give anything to them, right? And then stuff like kids and old people need to be taken care of. Well, markets can't provide for that either. So socialists wanted government to fill in where markets failed there. But they also didn't want to they weren't conservative, right? I mean, they didn't want to uphold these kind of, basically shitty views of poor people and try to control, everything they spend money on. They didn't want patriarchal views either. This is a big difference between social democratic and conservative welfare states is social democratic ones tie benefits to individuals. So for an example, if you're a mother or whatever that, wants to escape an abusive household with your kid, like the individual gets the benefits, right? It's not tied to the household. Or even if you're just, even if it's as simple as, this applies to like queer kids a lot are stuck in shitty households a lot of the times. Whereas, a social democratic welfare state would give you, Denmark, for example, gives you a stipend when you go to college so you can afford to pay for stuff for yourself. Or if you want to try and go look for a job, again, if you're on unemployment insurance, you'll get some money for yourself so you can actually, try to leave that household. And to tie it to another point, the social democratic approach is to have, the main goal is having one big program for every category of non-workers, right? So, there's one big public pension program that everybody pays taxes into and gets money out of. There's not this, all this segmented, stratified, all these different pensions. There's just one big program. Same for disability or same for unemployment insurance. That's especially relevant in the US where we have like 50 different unemployment insurance systems, and weird interplays between federal government and state government. It's a total mess. And yeah, so the social democratic approach is to have everybody kind of unified behind these big welfare programs that everyone's a part of. And we can get into, whole nother discussion too about how that followed from kind of the socialist goals that they had at the time.
Yeah, no, I think those are like really interesting points, and I think one of the people that really talks about this, especially about the first part that you were talking about. I remember Liz Brunig was on Ezra Klein's show, and she talks frequently about this, about the idea that that like the market and the ideals of liberalism are like completely enmeshed and kind of inextricable. And so it kind of pervades into how they build their welfare state regimes too. So I think it's a really interesting point that maybe we can talk about later. But I think this leads into kind of my second and third questions. But let's start off with the second one is, what do you think the state does better when provisioning welfare as compared to, let's say, in the liberal regime, you have the kind of market-based approach to welfare, and the conservative regime, you have like a guildism, a familial dependence kind of thing.
Yep.
What do you think necessarily that the state does just much better?
Yeah, so I'll one of the things I'll have you link is a great, I forget, this collection of economists wrote this whole article about basically talking about the state's necessary role in social insurance, and yeah, I think and this is where, again, I want to emphasize, the starting approach from the welfare state is thinking about non-workers, ensuring they have income, ensuring people have, smooth incomes over their lifetimes. But every group is a little different in this regard. So I'll pick a couple more examples. Long-term care, great example. People when they get older, a lot of times need someone to take care of them, part-time or full-time. And this is just, it's what happens when you get really old sometimes. Happens to tons of people. The problem is there's really, in the US, there's no good program to provide for that. And this is where, a free market type person might say, oh, well, you can buy insurance for it, and then you pay into it, when you're working or whatever. And if you need it, you'll get a payment from it, just like whatever, home insurance, car insurance works. But in practice, like those kinds of products just don't really exist. There's like basically no one who buys them. The markets are a total mess. They're basically just for rich people too. If you're poor or even middle class, you're basically screwed trying to get something like that. In the U.S., and this is a good example of how liberal welfare states really screw people over. A lot of times there's this bizarre incentive, which I don't want to get too much into, but basically boils down to people immiserate themselves, purposely make themselves poor to try to get Medicaid coverage for long-term care. Because, again, liberal welfare state gives a lot more to poor people. It's not about being universal. And so, like, you get this situation where, like, okay, the free market doesn't really provide it well. And then you try to have like government tinker around the edges and provide for poor people. And it leads to like these totally absurd incentives. You end up, people have to screw themselves over to even get the benefit of it. And long-term care, this is a wider thing that applies to many groups of non-workers, is that like walk up to somebody on the street and ask them, what's your chance of needing long-term care? They'll be like, what? Like, that's not a remotely knowable thing, right? Who knows when, I'm 23 right now. When I'm 80, who knows what conditions I have, what care I'll need? Who even knows what the chances are of me getting that kind of stuff? This gets at something, there's this topic for a whole nother podcast, I'm sure, this post-Keynesian idea of fundamental uncertainty, where like, it's one thing if like you don't know what's going to happen, but the chances of stuff happening. If I flip a coin, there's a 50% chance it's going to be heads, 50% chance it's going to be tails. Okay, I know it's going to happen. I can make, bets based on that and stuff like that. But that's actually a different thing from like, maybe I have an idea of the kinds of things that might happen, but I have no idea of the actual probabilities. There's so much stuff we encounter in our daily lives interfacing with the economy that we just have no idea what the actual probability of different events happening is. Long-term care is a great example of that. So is actually the big one for a program like Social Security. One of the reasons it was established is people might try to save up for retirement, but then they live longer than they expected and they just run out of money. And that is, again, like, you can't really predict ahead of time exactly how long you're going to live or anything like that. So you can't really adequately plan for it. And so, all of this adds up to markets do not do this very well, cannot do this very well. And you can't, tinkering around the edges doesn't solve the fundamental problem. It's not just a poor person problem that, you might get old and need really expensive long-term care. This is a problem everybody faces, and so that's why the government needs to step in and provide this stuff. It needs to provide. Social Security, actually, pretty good example of this. Needs some fixes, but ensures it's one big program. Basically, the U.S. just has this program for public pensions. And by pension, to be clear, I'm just meaning a benefit you get while you're retired, while you're old. And yeah, one big program, and it's not just for poor people. It's middle class people get a lot of money out of it too. It makes sure that you don't run out of your savings. And another thing here is and this comes from thinking about it as social insurance. The government can make the biggest risk pools. There is no if you're insuring even I don't know 1,000 people under a healthcare plan, for example. If one of them starts racking up, whatever, they get a cancer diagnosis, they got to get chemotherapy, all these expensive, drugs, that can really drive up costs for everybody else. That's why you want to and insurance companies try to do this, try to make their risk pools, of people who buy from them really big. The government can make the biggest risk pools, the entire country. And so, that then you don't run into those problems of higher risk like that. Let's see, did I miss anything important? Yeah, like I said, there's different groups who have slightly different justifications for this. Go to a whole thing about how unemployment insurance, has these kind of macroeconomic benefits as well. You want to boost demand when there's a downturn, for example, and markets don't do that either. So yeah, I think it broadly, long story short, it boils down to people need insurance for the big stuff in life. Like I said, disability or having kids or getting old, or needing long-term care, or again, big one, needing health insurance. And that one has like 10 other total market failures we could talk about. And fundamentally, the market can't do this stuff well at all. And so that's why the government needs to step in and take over that role. And crucially, needs to push the private market out of this stuff, right? You don't want a situation like in Australia, for example, what is it called? Superannuation is it called? Where it's basically like a kind of privatized social security type system. And it ties everybody's returns into like how much they put in, and it's tied to individual plans and all that. It sucks for many reasons, as many people, David Slager on Twitter has talked a lot about how much it sucks. And
absolutely, yeah, David, he has a great source. I'm definitely gonna link him too. I hope to have him on the pod one day.
Yeah, he's great too, because I think this is something important. Not to get too myopic about like just looking at the United States. You need to look at other countries that have done other things right and screwed things up differently that we actually haven't screwed up, and see how that works out. And yeah, because long story short, you can look out across other countries and see when they try to do market provision of all this kind of stuff, and it doesn't work. Like, there's all these varieties. People try to do it all these different ways. It doesn't really work.
Yeah, I think these are absolutely 100% points I agree with. But I think there's also one step further that we should go on, and I don't feel that we talk about it a lot. But I think it's one. The other thing is also kind of freeing yourself from kind of like familial dependence. So I think one of the roles of the welfare state is also to reduce that kind of implicit power that your family members have over you. You're a non-worker when, let's say, you're a child or you're disabled or you're an old person. So I think one of the primary roles of the welfare state should also to free people from these kind of like coerced familial units. What are your thoughts on something like that?
Yeah. So crucial. That's a great point. And one thing that's definitely underemphasized is that goes both ways. It's stuff like, well, nowadays when kids are saddled with a lot of college debt, they're still living with their parents a lot of times to save money. So that's one example of, you're dependent on your parents in that way. But then it can go the other direction because, once your parents get older, they might need somebody to take care of them. And that means, well, now, like, again, if the state isn't providing for any of this stuff, you have to totally rearrange your life to make sure your parents, get the care that they need. Or in the other direction, if you have a kid, you have to totally rearrange your life to make sure they get childcare, if the government's not providing that stuff. And so, yeah, it's your if you are a non-worker, a lot of times you're depending on other people in your family to take care of you who could be older or younger than you, and then that disrupts both of your lives. And a lot of it's kind of interesting, have there's this whole right libertarian conservative thing about like, oh, welfare interferes with individual freedom and all that. When actually you can read kind of the social democratic welfare state design as trying to get maximum individual freedom as much as possible, not just decreasing poverty, which is great, and I mean that's freeing too in its own way. Not just decreasing poverty, not just whatever ensuring people have health insurance, but actually freeing individuals to make the choices they want in life. Another example, and this is less so within the family dependence, but talking about dependence on your job. This is a big thing in the United States. Noah Smith talks about this a fair bit. Is in the United States, health insurance is overwhelmingly tied to your job, and there's a dependence, there's a coercion there too, because it's like, maybe this job is shit and I can do better for myself, but I'm going to lose my health insurance while I'm looking for a job, and like, what if something happens to me and then the bills start piling up? I don't have a job, I can't get food on the table, and that
We're
is
like
again
clamping down on labor mobility, basically.
Right, exactly. Which you can talk about it, that actually does have just bad economic effects, but also just in terms of individual freedom is terrible. So yeah, there's a lot of different ways in which the welfare state can free people from having to depend on others. Instead of a thing of if you have a lot of people who are dependent on you in your household, in the free market or whatever, that's going to be a really poor household. But in the presence of a really good welfare state, the number of dependents does not matter to your actual household poverty, because your old people will have long-term care. You got kids, you'll be getting money from a child allowance. People are disabled, they'll be getting money from that too. So no longer are dependents kind of this are coerced in that way to have to rely on family for that stuff.
Yeah, and it basically maximizes like your freedom as a family unit in general. But okay, I think this is a good point to kind of switch gears, and this has been really the discourse basically for the past week. But one of the things that we're talking about basically is we're trying to solve this really big like collective action problem, right? And with regards to, let's say, pensions or health insurance or whatever. And as you and I probably believe, the best way to solve these collective action problems is through taxation. So what's the kind of taxation policy that we envision to fund the social insurance? Because that's been a real hot button topic of discussion this week.
Yeah, so there's a lot to say there. I've spent way too long thinking about this. And
Haven't we all?
yeah, I've always been I've always been really into math, and I think that's why I've just spent so much time thinking about taxes. I think the starting point here to think about, and this can confuse a lot of discussion, I think, is a lot of times people who are somewhat into economics will have this idea of they want to put taxes on stuff like carbon or pollution in general, right? Stuff with externalities, right? Stuff with if you release carbon into the air, it actually affects everybody else. And in a free market, you're not paying for the way it affects everybody else.
It's not
So,
priced in. So like the Pigovian
right,
taxation, basically.
right, the Pigovian taxation thing. But I actually think that's a subset of a larger point, which is like tax revenue from a tax, like when tax revenue from a tax increases, it should be tied into higher spending in a way that makes sense. And to give you an example of this, I think Medlock is I forget who this quote is from now, but he talks about consumption taxes as and again I forget who the quote is from. Maybe you can remind me that there's this problem of we need to provide more public goods, more public services, right? And well, we have this big economy producing a bunch of private goods. Well, the obvious answer there is we need to tax the private stuff to provide for the public stuff. And that will move resources from one to the other. And that is that totally makes sense because as the private economy gets bigger, you'll want to provide more and more public goods. The revenue for that will want to go up. And another example you could think of is like a wealth tax, for example, right? If wealth inequality gets higher, there's a lot more really rich people, you want to be pulling more taxes from them, because you want to try to be decreasing wealth inequality. But as I've said many times now, the welfare state isn't just about, it serves this function of redistribution, true, but also of, someone called it was Nicholas Barr, has this article talking about, it's also a piggy bank, right? For social insurance, in addition to he calls it the Robin Hood function of redistribution. People get confused about that in the US and they think welfare is just about redistribution and therefore we need to fund it with just really progressive taxes. But again, using the example of wealth taxes, let's say there are no more billionaires. There are no more even most money anybody has is $10 million. You still need money for welfare. That hasn't, that fact hasn't changed. So tying funding for welfare into a tax like that doesn't make any sense. What you want is, if it's serving an insurance function, you want it to be that as people are making more wages, more money gets paid into and out of the welfare system. And for a lot of stuff, I think this is why I am a lover of the payroll tax, because payroll taxes are a very obvious, this is how much wages you make now. Something like the FICA tax, which funds Social Security, is literally this is the money that you make now. We're taking it and putting it into a fund, and it's paying you back when you get old. FDR has this quote where he's talking to some economist, and the economist is like, "Oh, we should have done a consumption tax. It would have been better for the economic reasons." And he's like, "Yeah, I guess maybe, but I did it that way to kind of create a sense of entitlement for people, right? They feel like they're paying into a system they're gonna get money out of later, and that's why it'll be resistant to cuts. And yeah, I think that idea is important in general. You want people to feel like they're paying into a system, because it's there's a big difference between, I'm getting money from somebody else, right? And if that money goes away, well, that sucks. Versus if I'm paying into a system and start getting less out of it, I'm gonna be really pissed off. That's just kind of a fundamental thing. You see showing up all the time. I'm always reminded of the classic, a guy at a town hall stood up, and there's some representative holding a town hall, and guy stood up and yelled something like, "Keep the government out of our Social Security." And there's kind of this idea in this that, which of course makes no sense, but it's important to keep in mind that's how people think of it, right? It's my Social Security. I paid into it. I should get out of it. So yeah, it's important, I think, for taxes to create that sense of entitlement, and to make sure, even if inequality has been, even if we nationalize the vast majority of wealth, even if we massively compress wages, there still needs to be money funding all of this stuff. So you want the taxes to fund the stuff should be coming from places that will exist even without high wealth, inequality or high wage inequality. So yeah, I think that's the main way to think about that stuff. That's not to say, other taxes have no uses. Wealth inequality is bad, and we should combat that. For example, but just that I think people get confused as to the point of taxes because they get confused about what the welfare state does.
Yeah, I think we've kind of enmeshed the idea of the welfare state that we kind of want, progressive taxation itself, instead of,
Yeah.
because I think at some point down the road, I think, maybe we can reach a consensus that, right now a progressive taxation may be good because it's politically viable. It's something you can
Right.
sell to the American electorate. But somewhere down the road, you have to bite the bullet and increase taxes on everybody. And I believe Bernie did this in the primaries with the, if you're in the middle class, you'll also have to have a small tax increase offsetted by, reduction in the co-pays, deductibles, whatever it was.
The only man brave enough to
But
say I'll increase your taxes.
yeah, exactly. Because, and you can talk about this a little bit more, but we want to avoid that kind of trilemma of the welfare state, where we have like a shrinking source of income going to the rich, no middle class taxation, but also a growing welfare state. It's just not possible to have all three, basically. Matt Brunick talks about this a lot. David Sliger, I think, talks about it too. But so if I'm getting it right, you do agree that kind of prioritizing progressive taxation over everything is a suboptimal situation because somewhere down the road we do have to increase taxes on everybody. So do you think this is kind of a bad kind of long-term political strategy?
Yeah, it is kind of complicated, and I saw we were all having this argument on Twitter a little bit back, but it's a complicated situation because all the points you said are totally true. That article about the trilemma is great. It's basically that article by Matt Brunig talks about how if you want to, if you only have really progressive taxes and you want to fund a welfare state, you have to keep pre-tax inequality high to keep the funds for that, which makes no goddamn sense. Like that's not, like the whole point of this is like inequality everywhere else is bad, needs to be reduced too. And yeah, so I think the main word I would use, progressive taxation has its place, but people just get myopic about it. And the kind of short-term thing of it's totally, if you want to make the argument that like broad-based taxes, we need them, but it's not possible right now, you can reasonably make that argument, but do not confuse that for the argument that we only need progressive taxes. Very, very different things. And yeah, I think the focus should really be, what places can we actually get support for broad-based tax increases? I think I mentioned this in our discussion on Twitter. Stuff like long-term care, for example. People seem pretty supportive of broad-based taxes to pay for that. That is a thing a lot of people are scared of. People who are older are scared about needing it. People who are younger are scared about having to provide it for their parents. I think you can get support for stuff like that.
Yeah, even things like childcare, like child Medicare for all children. I think it's like an immensely popular policy position, if I remember correctly.
Right. So it's something you have to, and these are kind of complicated. The policy of this, I don't think is that complicated. Like if you made me dictator, for a year in the United States, I could solve the welfare state. That's not the issue here. The issue is the politics of it, right? Is how do you, in a country that's stuck in this cycle of, not providing social services very well, so no one wants to pay taxes because the taxes aren't going to do anything for me. The government sucks, and therefore the government doesn't have the money to do anything. It's like, it's a really hard political question of how do you get people out of that cycle, into the Nordic cycle, right? Of, it's always great. There's these great videos of people interviewing like Swedish people, for example, and they're like, "What are your taxes?" And they're like, "It's like 50%." And they're like, "Wow, that's high." And the Swedish people are always like, "Yeah, I mean, it's high, but I get all this stuff for it." And like, it is a very basic idea that is repeated over and over again. And that's like the good state you want to be in. And the political question of how to get from one for the other is incredibly hard, especially, without even bringing into, all the stuff about education polarization and the stuff in the electoral college and all of that. And yeah, it's definitely a very complicated political question.
Yeah, the procedural things are absolutely so tough. And I was talking to Chad last week about, social welfare, social wealth funds in general, and the kind of like procedural and political ways that we can go about bringing this about. But these are questions that hinge on like so many things that absolutely have to go right at the same time for it to happen. So yeah, the procedural questions are very difficult to answer. But I do think, and I don't know if you do agree with this, but I do want to put this out, and I want to get your opinion on this. Is I think right now the way that Biden's going about this is like kind of the worst of both worlds. Because he's been more leftist than we'd expected, which is obviously a very good thing. Um, he wants to build like this kind of robust infrastructure bill that would inevitably help a lot of people. But for doing this, he says, we're gonna raise taxes on the richest people, which if that's probably the most politically popular position in America right now. Cool. I think I'm all for that. But then you kind of implicitly, not even explicitly, he ties that in with the idea of, no one making under $400,000 should ever have to pay a cent for it.
Right.
So I think at that point, we're kind of coupling together like two conflicting, contradictory ideas that in the long term just don't help us at all, because as for all the points that you were just making. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So there's a couple things there. There's a couple things I cringe at in Biden's messaging here. And one is that like the limit he put on, was it people only making over $400,000?
400,000.
That's so
which is extremely wealthy, by the way.
That's so high. And Matt Bruning made this point once that like Democrats for a
we,
while.
we have this discourse every 2 weeks about what is rich, anyways.
I think that's, and it's true, not to get into a whole thing about that. It's kind of misplaced because it's just the scale, right? You get richer, right? But at the same time, like when you set the bar that high, you limit yourself so much. And Democrats, it seems, have been actually increasing the bar over time, not decreasing it. Like I think Clinton said $200,000 or something instead. Said it had a similar statement, but with $200,000 instead. And so that's something I always cringe at. The other thing I cringe at is when he says, he's like, oh, we'll increase taxes on the rich. Okay, cool. And then he has this thing about, oh, but we'll cut taxes for lower and middle class people. And I'm like, no, what are you doing? Because it into this. You can have this whole discourse about how welfare and taxes are just the opposite of each other, right? There's not a real difference, besides in administrative stuff. But what he's doing is he's feeding into like this American idea that basically taxation is theft. Like that is, you see this in conservative circles, of course, and in liberal circles and in way more leftist circles than I'm comfortable with, that like it boils down to this idea of like, this group, lower middle class people should pay less in tax and rich should pay more because we want to take money, from rich people, and the government shouldn't be taking money from these people. And like, no, that's like that is a right libertarian view of how taxation works. That's totally the wrong thing to feed. And you're never going to build support for a truly progressive welfare state if everybody's running around thinking that taxation is theft. You need a different view of it. That actually, a program like Social Security or Medicare, for example, actually very much has this principle of like, yeah, everyone pays into it and everybody gets the benefits of it from when they're older. And it's weird to me that Democrats don't try to build on that more. And it's like they've seized like they've kind of, how should I phrase this right? There's been a lot of populist, zeitgeist, and I don't mean populist, in a negative way necessarily, about income and wealth inequality, and obviously it's really bad and it's a problem. But like, I feel like a lot of liberal leaders have like seized on that and just been like, oh, the only thing we need to do is tax rich people more. Then the problem shall be fixed. And yeah, that's just kind of it's a short-sighted view of things, and not to get into a whole discussion about capitalism, but often totally misdiagnoses the problem in the first place. There are not just that taxes on rich people are too low; it's that the money they're getting in the first place is too high. So yeah, I think that's the main problem. It's not even like, whatever, if this round of budget bills all we can do is increase taxes on people that are that rich, I mean, whatever, right? I mean, we can still deficit spend a lot more. It's not the end of the world. Stuff like climate change is really, the more pressing concern nowadays. The thing I'm more concerned about is feeding into this idea that, taxation is theft, and, the government shouldn't be taking money from you. It should only be taking money from, people who have a lot of it. And I think, you could get into stuff about how it's a key idea people forget a lot. And again, David Sliger has a great piece on this. I think it's called something like talking about how the key part of social democratic welfare states is they tax a lot. They tax more. Base class, this is people don't understand how marginal tax rates work. Also, if you raise taxes on middle class people, taxes on rich people also go up, because if you think of how tax brackets work, rich people pass through those tax brackets also, so they will also pay those taxes, and then you can redistribute that money. If you redistribute it evenly and universally, well, now you've increased equality. People get confused, I think, on that point. Um, that is again something that I'm like, what if Joe Biden just had a message to Americans, like a fireside chat of just explaining how marginal tax rates work? Like, I feel like this is legitimately a worthwhile thing, because it's so common that people say things like, "Oh, I moved into a higher tax bracket, so like therefore I'm losing money." Oh, that's not how it works. And people get really confused about that. And again, I think these are kind of related but different things. The kind of taxation is theft view beyond. You can make all these economic arguments that you want to, but a lot of people have this moral view that they just shouldn't be taxed. They should get to keep their money. And yeah, you'll never build a support for a good welfare state if everybody runs around thinking that all the time.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that leads nicely into our final question. We've talked a little bit about robust welfare states, the kind of society that we envision building in the short term. But after a robust welfare state, like what's next? Like where do we want to progress to past that?
After that, I'm playing video games a lot more.
Aren't we all?
I'm sitting back with a fruity drink in the tropics and hanging out. Yeah, so there's an interesting scenario I want to point out later, but this relates back to what I said about like why did social democrats pick the design of a welfare state that they did? And basically, it boils down to they wanted worker solidarity. They wanted workers all on the same page behind these programs. They wanted poor and middle class workers together on this stuff, so they can better oppose capitalists, basically. And that's true in a couple of ways. And one is that like you want to make it so that you worry less about striking against your boss, because if you become unemployed, well, whatever. I got an 80% wage replacement rate. It's fine. And yeah, a whole nother discussion about maintaining full employment too, so people can just find other jobs. That empowers working people too.
Yeah, I hope to tackle full employment in one of the upcoming podcast episodes.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it is interesting. Quick aside that social democrats focused a lot on full employment and is like kind of left out a lot of modern discussions. This is something I will say Biden has been very good on. He's repeating this. He repeats it over and over that he's like, yeah, well, we gotta like, we gotta get employment rates up higher, because then people can just feel free to switch jobs. And someone mentioned like, oh, what about the shortage in this area or whatever? And he's like, well, you're gonna have to pay them more if you want them. And it's interesting how kind of people often talk about like welfare states as if it's a Keynesian thing, but like Keynes was a lot more, in my reading of him, was a lot more focused on maintaining full employment than he was about like welfare state design or whatever. And he kind of came to the same conclusion as social democrats did from a very different viewpoint. But yes, full employment should be emphasized more. But anyways, like I said, the goal of this was to empower workers against capitalists. And I think, it's like, you get into a lot of dumb arguments online about this, but the fact is, that Nordic welfare states have actually held up pretty much. There have been cuts here and there, there have been cuts in spending and stuff like that. But workers in Nordic countries maintain a much higher level of power than they have over here. And welfare states are definitely a big part of that. And I think the way to think about this is, you want to build welfare states that have a ratchet effect. That, once you pass the stuff, it stays locked in, and it's, really, really hard to turn it back. Because then next time, when progressives get back in power, leftists get back in power, you can do more, and you can keep on going, forever. And to that point, this is a whole other thing you can get into. Eventually, like if you solve the problem of social insurance, right, and ensure people's incomes are smooth and everything, eventually people will still say, they'll say, great, this is a great society we have here. But a couple fundamental problems haven't been addressed. Capitalists are still, leeching off tons of profit from the economy, and capitalists are, there's actually three problems. Capitalists are controlling production, right? I don't have a say in my workplace. And capitalists are controlling investment, and they're trying to invest in whatever, wrecking the Amazon rainforest, and maybe we want to, I don't know, do some, maybe we want to replant trees, maybe we want to beautify the cities or whatever. Maybe we just want to invest in cool new technology, um, and that we fundamentally don't have control over that, even after a full great welfare state has been established. And I think as it's only natural that as people's kind of immediate material concerns are met through the welfare state, they'll start thinking about that stuff more. They'll also, in a very literal sense, have more time and ability to think about that. If you're no longer stressing the hell out over making sure you can afford health insurance or whatever, or no longer panic looking for a job whenever you're unemployed, you're literally just going to have more time and energy to look at society and address that kind of stuff. And the interesting thing I wanted to point out is there's a very funny, the kind of absurdly funny future of America is a possibility. Goes something like this. You can kind of think of this in the opposite direction. Is that like we don't actually get really like big increases in welfare spending. We don't get a really great welfare state, but instead people start building out public assets. Building out socialist ownership, whether that's cooperative stuff, whether that's building a bunch more social housing and stuff like that. Because that's actually, it's very interesting. This gets back to this is kind of Keynes's idea of his goal wasn't so much socializing production, keeping control of production in the hands of people. It's about socializing investment, and that actually seems to be something that like it just doesn't trigger the same stuff as tax and welfare policy does. Americans, like I said, Americans don't, generally don't like taxes. You got to be careful about putting taxes on them. They have all these things about welfare queens and all these often racist ideas about poor people, right? But kind of like building out, whether that's worker ownership or just social investment and stuff, just doesn't trigger the same stuff, and is like, they don't even read it as socialist. That's not like it doesn't feel that way to them. And so I think there's, something to keep in mind is it's true, I think, that as we expand the welfare state, that will set the grounds for greater socialist gains. But I think this also kind of works in both directions. In like, there's a lot of socialist gains we can start to make now, but like giving stock of workplaces to employees is way more popular. Let's say significantly more popular than Medicare for All is, for example. Even though like it seems a lot more radical. And you can also, once if we expand this public ownership of stuff, that's another way to prove that government works for people. And then that feeds back into, well, now they support more welfare for people. Or even just, this is talked about with unions, for example. If you get everybody into a union together, they stop viewing each other as the other, as someone fundamentally different who needs to be, needs to be controlled in the way they spend stuff, or, needs to be distrusted. And that too builds support for welfare spending. Because, instead of thinking of, again, racist stuff about welfare queens or whatever, they'll just think of, oh, well, I knew a guy in my union who became disabled while I was working, and yeah, he needs some more money. So I think that's the key thing to keep in mind is it's not just like, oh, we need to build the welfare state and then do the socialism. All of this stuff feeds back into each other. And any leftist should be looking for any pathway, they can get into, given political circumstances, to expand this stuff, and it will feed into all of the other stuff that we like.
I think that's an excellent answer. That was the last of my questions. I think that was a very interesting hour. I'm glad we had this conversation. So thank you for coming on, Keegs. I'm going to be linking all the articles that we talked about today. Do you have any closing remarks or anything you'd like to leave with us before we go?
Um, Follow James Medlock on Twitter. Uh,
Follow you on
uh,
Twitter. Follow Lil Keegs on Twitter.
that's right. That's right. Donate to some abortion funds in Texas if you haven't already.
Absolutely.
Um, and yeah, I hope everyone has a great day. Read a little more than you have been is what I would suggest. Find
Absolutely.
find some stuff you're interested in. Read an article or two, even if it's like once a week or whatever. Totally worth it. Can massively expand the amount of stuff you know.